This is the Provoked Prawn, and get yourself a nice cup of tea because I'm about to tell you what's good with the Razer Huntsman V3 Pro TKL. Now, on the face of it, this is a pretty standard looking Razer keyboard. However, it has a number of really interesting hidden highlights that aren't immediately obvious, and some things that confused me. For example, when I plugged in my controller, I found that the controller no longer worked. And that's because this keyboard sports Razer's optical analog switches, which actually have a special mode that you can program to basically change your keyboard into a controller so that you can have all the controls from a standard controller on your keyboard and then play racing games and other things, which I'm going to go into more depth later on, which is pretty quirky and interesting depending on whether you're doing this sort of thing or not. It also has a number of different profiles on board that you can switch between using the function button and then these buttons over here. But more interestingly, if you press the function button and caps lock and tab, you can then on the fly adjust both the rapid trigger and actuation points of this keyboard. The Gen 2 optical switches are adjustable between 0.1mm actuation point and 4mm. And when you combine that with the rapid trigger setup, that means you can get some really responsive key presses out of the keyboard and fast actions. So if you're playing fast-paced FPS games or something that requires really accurate inputs and a really responsive setup, then this keyboard is really useful for that. So with the function key and tab and caps lock, you can set those modes and then you can adjust them on the fly. So for example, you can use the directional arrows to minimize the level by pushing it to the left or maximize by pushing it to the right. You can also use the multifunction wheel at the top to adjust this, and then you can see the response from it. More on that in a second, because it is a pretty neat feature of the keyboard and one I found really useful while gaming, although it's obviously very subjective experience. Now, on the box, you'll see that the Huntsman V3 Pro Tenkeyless features these settings. And by the way, you can also get a smaller 60% version of this and a full-size version too. In the package, you'll find the keyboard itself and this magnetic detachable leatherette wrist rest, which has a small bit of leather on top, but isn't particularly padded. However, because it's nice and low profile, I've actually found it pretty comfortable. As you can see, it's just got these magnets on it, so it slots into place fairly easily, so you can remove it when you want to. There's no clips that you could potentially break. Simple little features like that can make quite a difference. And then you got the Razer logo in the middle. I haven't actually found this has got terribly dirty during my use either, which is quite nice, although it does pick up a little bit of oils from your fingers. You'll see that there's a detachable USB-C cable included, which plugs in at the top left, so you could, in theory, replace with your own custom cable if you wanted to. Though obviously this isn't a wireless keyboard, sadly, so you don't have that benefit. There are some other hidden benefits that you might not notice though. For example, it does have some sound dampening foam internally to keep it quite quiet. And as you'll notice, if you pull off some of the keycaps, the key switches are also stabilized across the entire board, which means that they are very quiet to use, much quieter than your traditional Razer switches. And I found them very satisfying to type on as well. They've got a really nice press feel to them, delightful in this way. Now you will have noticed that those switches are obviously the analog optical switches, and that makes them interesting because they're designed to last longer over time. But also that optical switch means that you can adjust all those levels I showed you earlier on, and I'll get to more of that in the software in a minute. The keycaps are also PBT double shot, which means they're textured and shouldn't get shiny or worn out over time. The downside to this is, as you will see, some of the lettering doesn't quite show up that well. So there's some dim spots on some of the letters on the keyboard where the RGB doesn't quite shine through. The enter key, for example, you notice the E on that is a little bit dark at the edges, so it's not perfect in that way, but that's the trade-off of this sort of setup with the PBT double shot keycaps, is that they'll last longer, but they don't necessarily look as fancy. There are some other things. In the top right, you have this volume wheel and multifunction buttons, which I'm not a big fan of. Those buttons, I find them a bit finicky. They can be reprogrammed. The one on the right next to the volume wheel, for example, can be used for pausing, playing, and skipping tracks and rewinding. The volume wheel, when you push it in, is meant to mute. I found that a little bit hit and miss sometimes, weirdly. But otherwise, this setup is useful for adjusting the actuation points. So this is one of the things that is obviously going to be the main appeal. On the fly, you can press the function key and then tab, and then you'll see on the right hand side that you'll have a little indicator to let you know the actuation level that you're currently at. You can press the directional arrows to adjust that and then go typing once you've hit escape or pressed those buttons again. And that will basically set that actuation level, and you can set it up and work out what the best level is for you. If you notice that my typing is terrible, that's because I'm doing it in this really awkward position. So a quick behind the scenes look of how that's going. But what I wanted to show here is that you can basically set those levels and you get a gauge to show you the response for it. So the green marker is where the actuation point is, and then the white levels represent how far you've pressed it. Obviously, you can go up to 0.1 millimeter actuation, which means a very gentle touch will set that key off. Now, this is perfect for gaming, but not so much for everyday typing. Indeed, you may well find, as I've done, that if you lay your hands on the keys, even ever so gently, if you're just resting them on there between typing sessions, you may find you accidentally actuate these keys and they're pressing when you don't mean them to, and that's just how responsive those are. So I'd recommend setting up some different levels or maybe tweaking between those depending on whether you're gaming or working or using it for other things. You can see here just how fast those keys respond. Obviously, that 0.1 millimeter actuation is perfect for gaming because it means as soon as you press, that action's happening. Now, with the function key and page up, delete, end, and page down, you can switch between the various profiles. You'll see there's a number of different ones: FPS rapid trigger, analog mode, racing mode, and then high sensitivity. These obviously adjust between the different settings. Now you can go into Synapse and you can customize these and personalize them and then save, and obviously then switch between them on the fly. You can tweak those levels, but it's nice to have those pre-programmed in the board so you can easily change that if you want to without even using Synapse. You can then turn the rapid trigger on and off and assign it to specific buttons. So obviously using WASD, R, F, and space for FPS games might be logical. And then you basically setting a level where the trigger will go off. Now, how this works, what this means is essentially rapid trigger is working out when you've pressed the key and then when you go to release it and then press it again. But what it does is it works out this set level that you've got, and then it basically sets off again without you having to fully press the standard actuation point. So you can set a faster level. So on a traditional switch where you'd have to push it all the way down to activate the spring and the metal lever, with the optical switches instead it detects when you've lifted your finger up and then when you put it back down again, and without you having to push all the way in. So rapid trigger is great for FPS games where fast movement and fast action, and you want really key performance in there, and you want to make sure it's accurate in its responses, because you can combine that with a low actuation point and basically then just really get it reacting really quickly to your presses. You can also see this happening within Synapse, so you can get an idea of it, and visually on the keyboard as well, because you'll see when it's gone green, that's when it's activated. Then when it's red, it's basically deactivating, and then you can reactivate it again by just gently pressing it in. Now, I've obviously been using this in various different games. You can see Ready or Not here, but I've also been playing a lot of Escape from Tarkov lately, and I've found that this setup is really responsive for gaming on. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I also just find the key presses really satisfying in other ways. It's hard to put it into words, but I found this more sort of thuddy than previous Razer keyboards. It's nice to not have that Razer clicky sound, which I find a bit too loud, and it's also just got a pleasant feel to it. The sound dampening foam really also helps with that and makes for it a comfortable gaming experience, but the fact that it's so reactive and that you can just customize the levels to your own personal preference, and you can tweak and get a visual sort of look at that on the fly really easily, means that it's highly subjective in what you're doing with it, but you can also customize it to your own personal preference really easily. Now, the other thing that you can do is you can also gamepad remap, and this is what I was talking about earlier on. So you can basically set the keyboard up as a controller. This is done within Synapse, and you can set it so that WASD becomes the control joystick, and then Q and E becomes the left and right triggers. And you can see that you can test this on the fly here by just using the WASD key once you've set it and bound it, and then Q and E into this response mode as well. And I'd recommend assigning this to a profile. So obviously the racing profile makes sense for this use, as I'm doing, but you might be using it, I don't know, for combat games or something. But what you want to do here is also bear in mind that you'll have to set up the other buttons too. On the left-hand side, you can click the controller icon in there, and then you can just drag and drop the various different buttons onto the keyboard and assign them to where you want them to be. Now, I've put them all kind of close together, which I didn't really think out. It might be better off to put some on the right-hand side, then you can use both hands at the same time. But you can see that you can drag and drop all the buttons that you'd want from this and program it up. So it'll then work with Steam games where the keyboard then gets recognized as a controller, which is why when I plugged a controller in, that plane just wouldn't work alongside the keyboard at the same time. One thing to keep in mind here is once you've programmed this as a controller, those keys then no longer work for typing, at least in this mode, which is why having the racing profile separate from the others is pretty handy because you can switch into it and out of it depending on what you're doing. So if you want to go back to standard typing and browsing the web, you can just switch to one of the other modes, like the FPS one, for example, and then you can type again. However, it's interesting to be able to do this and quite quirky. I personally probably wouldn't use this, but if, let's say, you can't afford a controller or you don't want a controller and a keyboard, you now have the option to program your keyboard to be a controller and maybe also open up more button possibilities anyway, because you've got a lot more keys on the keyboard than you do as on a controller. And it also works surprisingly well, as long as you can remember what buttons you've programmed to be what, and then you can see me just mashing at buttons trying to drive in Need for Speed Unbound. So for me personally, it doesn't work. However, it is certainly responsive enough that you can do it. And obviously with the actuation points as well, you have that adjustment that you would have from triggers because of the optical switches and those actuation levels. So it's the same as having a controller with sort of response to the trigger press and how hard you're pressing and just the movement there in games. So it works for racing games for sure. So you can see there's a lot on offer here from this Razer keyboard, and actually very nice for a number of different reasons. My complaints would probably be about the multifunction buttons on the top. I'd much rather have dedicated playback buttons and things. One of the buttons basically just opens an Xbox game bar as standard, but you can customize those things within Synapse. But there's a lot of possibilities that you can do within Synapse. But even if you don't want to, you've got hardware buttons out of the box that you can just use to switch between the profiles and adjust things. The other thing I don't necessarily like is the RGB, which with Chroma is set up to respond to certain games. So when I've been playing Fortnite with my kids, the keyboard will flash like crazy. But obviously that's a Chroma thing. If you like RGB lighting and you like Chroma's RGB, then you may well find that nice. And obviously you can customize it as well. And as you've seen from the shots, despite what I said about the PBT setup, the lighting from it is actually fairly good, even under heavy video lighting. So you can still see the lettering quite nicely. So it does tick the boxes in a number of different ways. So stick around now for a sound test of what the switches sound like if you're curious. And if you've enjoyed this video so far and you're not already, please consider subscribing. Thanks very much for watching. You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos, you might well find them interesting or useful, and most importantly, have a great life.